You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. Balitang thinking, hindi breaking. In this episode,
Too much salt is the most important dietary risk factor for the global burden of disease. We have one adult in four that has a high blood pressure, and we have 2 million people dying every year as a result of consuming too much salt.
a World Health Organization report finds that the world is falling behind on its goal to reduce 30% of sodium intake by 2025.
Most of us are consuming too much salt. The WHO recommends to consume not more than 5 grams of salt every day, which is roughly half of what, on average, people consume in the world.
That's Dr. Francesco Branca, director of the WHO's Department of Nutrition for Health and Development.
Consuming too much salt is leading to increased blood pressure and to increased risk of death for heart disease and stroke.
The WHO says cutting back on salt is one of the most cost effective ways to improve health. It also estimates that some 7 million lives could be saved by 2030 if sodium reduction policies are implemented effectively.
Governments can nudge companies to put on the market products with less salt, but they can also offer meals in public institutions such as schools that contain less salt.
That's where states come in. All 194 WHO member states have committed to reducing their population sodium intake by 30% by 2025. But alarmingly, only 9 countries have implemented policies comprehensive enough to keep them on track. These countries are Brazil, Chile, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, Malaysia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Spain, and Uruguay. This was determined by the WHO using a scoring system of 1 to 4. A score of 1 means the country made a commitment to reduce salt consumption, but has yet to move forward. Meanwhile, a score of 4 was given to the countries I listed earlier. All 9 of them implement at least 2 mandatory measures to reduce sodium and other interventions recommended by the WHO. Can you guess how the Philippines fared? Well, it might surprise you to find we were given a score of 3, higher than most other countries in the Western Pacific region. The score means we have some sodium reduction policies, but they aren't comprehensive. For instance, the government can force manufacturers to mark salt content more clearly on prepackaged food. The average Filipino adult eats 10.4 grams of salt a day. While that's at par with the global average, it's more than double the 5 grams recommended by the WHO. And we've suffered the consequences. Listen to Department of Health Officer in Charge, Maria Rosario Vergere.
Sa ngayon po, nakikita natin na ang mga top leading causes of deaths dito sa ating bansa ay bumalik na doon sa dati nating trends kung saan yun pong atake sa puso, yung ischemic heart disease pa rin ang nauuna.
Ischemic heart disease is the most common form of cardiovascular disease. The WHO office in the Philippines in 2021 said 20% of Filipinos suffer from high blood pressure.
Meron po tayong mga sakit na tinatawag na non-communicable diseases katulad ng high blood, katulad po ng mataas na kolesterol, katulad po ng diabetes at iba pang mga sakit na maaring magtungo sa pangit o critical na kondisyon para sa inyong mga pamilya at para sa inyong sarili.
We'll pause here, but when we return, Dr. Francesco Branca tells us what we can do to personally reduce our salt intake.
You can get salt from what you add to foods at home, or you can get salt from the manufactured products. Just to give you an example, if you take an average bag of chips of 150 grams, that bag of chips contains half of the salt we're supposed to consume every day.
One main culprit for rich countries, but increasingly developing ones as well, is processed food.
In many high-income countries, the largest amount of salt comes from manufactured food. About 80% comes from manufactured food, such as bread, cheeses, preserved meat, but also high salt snacks and food consumed out of home. Normally the same preparation that we consume at home is less salt than the one that is produced in a restaurant, for example.
Meanwhile, in countries like ours, home-cooked meals are often big contributors to our salt intake. Not to mention the condiments that are pantry staples in most Filipino homes.
In lower income countries, sodium or salt comes mainly from what is added during the home preparation and during the preparation of preserves. And it comes from condiments or other sauces that are added to the food.
Although the problem is widespread and requires systemic action, we don't have to wait on the government to improve our health now.
Some of it is under our control, and we can add less salt during cooking. You can progressively reduce salt in our diet and adjust your taste. It will take a few weeks, but eventually you will be able to reduce your salt intake. Remember that we need to do that by 1/3 to 1/2 of our current intake.
That doesn't mean we have to give up taste entirely. There are plenty of other ways to season food that don't require as much sodium.
We can replace it with other seasoning, lemon, juice, spices. We can also decide to buy less of the food that contains a high amount of salt, the processed food. We can buy less frequently certain options.
And when salt is non-negotiable, we can be smarter about the products we buy.
We can also buy alternatives. The same products sometimes is designed to contain less salt. And if you look at the labels, it's actually explicitly mentioned that it could be a low salt product. We can also altogether replace certain options with healthier ones.
We can also eat less processed food and replace them with healthier alternatives.
So if you reduce the consumption of salty snacks, you can instead consume fruit and or vegetable as a snack. And fruit and vegetable not only contains less salt, but they contain another important mineral, potassium, which is protective for our arteries and actually protects us from increased blood pressure.
Of course, a good chunk of our population doesn't have the luxury of eating healthier. And that's why ultimately, the WHO wants governments to implement wide-reaching policies and interventions. These steps include introducing mandatory limits on how much salt can be added to processed foods, implementing food procurement policies in public institutions, adding front-of-package labeling of sodium content, and mass media campaigns.
It's not just our responsibility, but it's what we see in the food environment we live. So there could be really an overall collaboration between individual consumers and public health authorities to help us reduce the risk of high blood pressure by reducing salt intake.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was edited by Pidoy Blanco. If you like this episode, share it with a friend or two. And don't forget to give it a 5-star rating on your podcast app. At para sa mga mahilig manood sa YouTube, Puma Podcast na rin po kami doon. Just search Puma Podcast and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for listening.